The morning sun fell in generous patches across the green of the vicarage lawn, where tables were set with embroidered cloths, stacks of china teacups, and baskets of Victoria sponge. The annual Chipping Woodley Garden fete had arrived once, more a cheerful if predictable highlight in the village's calendar. Children darted between the jam stall and the coconut shy, and older ladies took up residence near the tea-urns, where gossip could steep as well as the Earl Grey Miss E. Jane Marple sat beneath the generous shade of an elm tree, her pale blue parasol tilted at just the right angle to keep the glare from her delicate eyes. Her knitting needles clicked gently as she worked on what appeared to be a pair of baby booties, though for whom, none could say, as Miss Marple had neither nieces nor nephews within calling distance. "Miss Marple," called the vicar's wife, bustling over with the urgency only reserved for half-sliced Battenberg cake. "Do try some of this. Mrs. Edgecombe claims it's her own recipe, but I swear it's straight out of the Woman's Weekly Baking Companion. Page 42. Miss Marple smiled. "I believe that's the one that calls for almond essence and no lemon zest. If it's hers, she's left out both." A gentle titter of appreciation came from Mrs. Grafton, who had sidled up to refill her tea. The fete was in full swing, bunting fluttering, church bells occasionally pealing, the brass band working its way into the second, rather wheezy rendition of Jerusalem. And then it happened. A small cry first, sharp, startled, then quickly stifled. Heads turned toward the rose garden just past the trellis where the judge of the scone competition had disappeared moments before to inspect the entries. It was young Beatrice, daughter of the grocer, and well known for her dramatics, who came stumbling out, hand clapped to her mouth. "There's a shoe," she gasped. "In the roses. Only one. And a bit of stocking too. And something else. It's red." The red was not from the roses. In the curious hush that followed, the clink of a teacup being hastily set down sounded like a cymbal crash. Reverend Phipps hurried over with surprising speed, pushing past the ladies with an apologetic flutter. The constable, who had been manning the tombola with a remarkable lack of enthusiasm, abandoned his post and trotted awkwardly after the Reverend. Miss Marple, who had risen quietly from her seat, took her time. The lace of her sleeve trembled slightly in the breeze as she folded her parasol and made her way toward the roses. The crowd parted before her without realizing it. In the bed of old English roses, the red was unmistakable now. A woman lay half-hidden. Beneath the blossoms, her body crumpled, her face turned to one side in unnatural stillness. Her left foot was bare. On the right, a pale blue heel with a broken strap. "I think that's one of the Blacklock twins," whispered Mrs. Grafton faintly behind Miss Marple. "Hetty or Letty? Oh, but which one?" Indeed, the resemblance had always been uncanny, identical in face and figure, though not in temperament. The Blacklock sisters had moved into Ivybank Cottage only 6 months earlier, full of Brighton sophistication and vague references to retired theatrical work. The villagers, intrigued at first, had quickly tired of the sisters' sharp tongues and noisy late-night guests. Still, murder was another matter entirely. "She's dead, isn't she?" asked a voice near Miss Marple. Young Thomas Braithwaite, the vicar's nephew, who had taken to haunting the fete like a bored spectre on holiday from prep school. "I believe so," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze falling to the lone shoe resting awkwardly among the petals. "Though what strikes me as odd is not the presence of a shoe, but the absence of its match." She turned slowly, eyes passing over the shocked and murmuring crowd, pausing just long enough on each face to register the expressions behind the horror, the two curious ones, the pale ones, the surprised and the curiously blank. "It's terribly inconvenient," she said gently, more to herself than anyone else, "when one forgets where one's put a shoe. But it's odder still when only one ever turns up at all." And with that, she turned her eyes again to the body, while all around the fete, having collapsed under the weight of its own spectacle, began to dissolve into fragments, upturned. Chairs, dropped sandwiches and whispers that would echo through chipping woodley for weeks to come. The vicarage lawn, so recently alive with laughter and the scent of elderflower cordial, had quieted into a stunned murmur. As the brass band silently packed away their instruments and anxious whispers trickled through the departing crowd, Reverend Phipps stood awkwardly at the edge of the rosebed, wringing his hands in helpless discomfort. Constable Rowan, a stout young man with more good intention than experience, crouched beside the body, his face pale and furrowed with the weight of sudden responsibility. "I'll need to fetch Dr. Partridge," the constable said, straightening with effort, "and notify the station in Downminster. This'll be a formal matter now." Miss Marple, who stood just behind the Reverend, nodded faintly, though she said nothing. Her eyes lingered once more on the blue shoe, its companion nowhere to be seen, and then slowly rose to scan the assembled faces. Mrs. Edgecombe's wide, startled eyes darted away from Miss Marple's gaze. Young Beatrice still hovered near the edge of the garden, clinging to her mother's skirt with the breathless air of someone who both regretted and relished her accidental discovery. Dr. Partridge arrived within 15 minutes, a small, wiry man with pince-nez and the temperament of one long resigned to the village's minor ailments and major hysteria. After a cursory examination, he stood, brushing a leaf from his trousers. "Yes, dead. For at least 2 hours, I'd say," he said briskly. "Blunt trauma to the skull. Heavy object, perhaps a rock. No obvious signs of struggle, though I dare say the roses have hidden much." He removed his glasses and sighed, giving the crowd a stern glance. "No one is to touch the body until the coroner arrives, and I expect you all to make yourselves available for questioning." But Miss Marple was not listening to Dr. Partridge. She'd stooped low beside a border of lavender, carefully peering into the shadow beneath a bush. A small smear of something brownish-red marred a flat stone, and nearby, just out of reach, a piece of torn fabric fluttered in the breeze. "She must have been dragged slightly," Miss Marple murmured, half to herself. "Or perhaps she staggered. But then, why only one shoe?" She straightened with a slight wince, accepted a supportive arm from the vicar, and looked toward the cottage path that led from the Blacklocks' home to the fete. It was well trodden, and the rosebed lay directly alongside it. Anyone could have slipped away for a moment during the festivities without much notice. The gossip, of course, began before the coroner's van had even arrived. They always were peculiar, Mrs. Grafton declared at the tea shop the next morning, where a few determined villagers had gathered as though routine could somehow repel tragedy. Both of them, those twins, too glamorous for a place like this. Not that I mean that as a criticism, but there's something very unsettling about people who look exactly the same and yet act so differently. "Indeed," said Mrs. Edgecombe, stirring her tea as though trying to divine answers from its swirling contents. Letty was the charming one, always had a smile, remembered birthdays, but Hetty, well, she had a sharp tongue, didn't she? I remember she snapped at old Mr. Willits for breathing too loud during evensong. "Oh, and the men," added Mrs. Weaver, leaning in with a whisper. "Always had visitors, those two, especially that rather handsome fellow. What was his name? Mr. Gerard. Gave piano lessons, or so he said, but no one saw him with a piano, did they?" Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively at the end of the table, with her usual weak Darjeeling and a modest slice of seed cake, nodded mildly, but said little. Her thoughts, while appearing benign, were far from idle. She had passed Ivybank Cottage that morning on her walk, not with the intention of snooping, though she admitted to herself that the distinction was thin, but simply to observe. A constable had been stationed outside, and the front curtains remained drawn. From the garden gate, she noted that the flower beds were unusually pristine, the gravel path neatly raked. Someone had taken pains with the presentation, but it was the porch that caught her attention, A solitary blue heel lay on its side beside the door, its twin to the one worn by the victim. The strap was intact, no signs of scuffing. Miss Marple studied it for several seconds, lips pursed. "If that's Hetty, then Letty is missing," she said quietly. The village confirmed it within the hour. Letty Blacklock had not been seen since the previous evening. No one had observed her leave the fete. No letters, no phone calls, and no answer at the door when Constable Rowan returned to make inquiries. But the teacups in the kitchen were freshly washed, and a light cardigan was missing from its usual hook. There had been 2 slices of toast on the plate, and only one had been eaten. "I don't like it," the constable muttered to Miss Marple when she passed the cottage again later that day. If she was scared, why not come forward? If she's not scared, then where the devil has she gone? "Unless she's neither," Miss Marple said gently. Rowan blinked. "Beg your pardon, miss. Just that she might not be frightened, nor missing, nor gone. Not in the way we think." He looked at her, blank and a touch frustrated, but knew better than to press. Miss Marple, when she began talking like that, was generally on the scent of something. That afternoon brought more pieces, though no clearer picture. Mr. Gerard, the charming piano teacher, had left the village 3 days prior, supposedly to attend a cousin's wedding in London. A message was sent, and the local inspector assured Rowan that a follow-up was underway, and then there was the letter. Young Thomas Braithwaite had come across it purely by accident, or so he claimed, while poking around the edge of the fete grounds with a stick. It was folded tightly, slightly damp, and bore no envelope. He handed it to Constable Rowan with all the gravity of a boy presenting a captured snake. The constable, in turn, passed it to Miss Marple, who read it in silence. "You said we'd be free after tonight, but you lied. You always lie. I should have listened to the other one. The writing was slanted, fast and angry. No name, no date, no context." But to Miss Marple the meaning whispered just beneath the surface. The other one. A lie. A promise of freedom. It smelled of desperation and betrayal. As the sun dipped behind the hedgerows and the village sank into a premature hush, Miss Marple sat once more on her floral settee, with her knitting in her lap, and the letter resting beside the ball of pale yellow yarn, a shoe without its match. A sister without her twin. A promise broken. A lie exposed. Someone had wanted one of the Blacklocks dead, and someone, Miss Marple suspected, had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure it happened under the cover of sameness, confusion, and perhaps even substitution. But the trouble with identical twins, she reflected, is that they may look alike, but they rarely act alike. And in the end, it is always behavior, not appearance, that reveals the truth. She reached for her notebook and jotted down a single line. Which sister wore the heel, and which one broke the strap? The following morning dawned cool and misty, the village of Chipping Woodley wrapped in a fragile stillness that seemed reluctant to be broken. The garden fete, which had once been a bright gathering of neighbours, now lingered in the air like a half-forgotten dream, tinged with unease. Even the birds sang with restraint. Miss Marple left her cottage early, her eyes alert beneath the brim of her straw hat as she made her way toward Ivy Bank Cottage. The police had lifted their cordon, but the air around the place remained heavy, with quiet urgency. The garden gate stood ajar, its hinges creaking softly in the morning breeze, and Miss Marple hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. She found the place far from empty. Constable Rowan was there, speaking quietly with Mrs. Blacklock, Letty's mother, a pale woman whose composed demeanour cracked only once when she glanced toward the rosebed. Across the path, a young man who bore a striking resemblance to the late Hetty Blacklock stood with folded arms and a face marked by taut nerves. This was Daniel, their cousin, a visitor from London who had arrived late the previous evening. Miss Marple greeted them with her customary calm. "Good morning. I trust the night has brought no further disturbances." Constable Rowan nodded, though he looked anything but reassured. "No, ma'am, but the questions keep piling up. For one, we still haven't found Letty." Mrs. Blacklock's lips trembled faintly. "It's as if she vanished. The police searched the village last night and this morning, but there is no sign of her." Daniel stepped forward. "She wouldn't just run off, not without telling someone." "That's what puzzles me," Miss Marple said gently. "If Letty intended to disappear, there would have been some indication, but you say there was no sign of a struggle?" "None," said Rowan. "And the doctor confirms that Hetty's injuries were inflicted somewhere else. She must have been killed before the fate began." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "That does complicate the timeline. It suggests the body was placed in the rose bed deliberately after the murder." Mrs. Blacklock drew a shaky breath. "But who would do such a thing? My daughters had their differences, but I never imagined—" Daniel interrupted, voice low and urgent. "I spoke to the neighbours last night. A few heard raised voices coming from Ivy Bank late into the evening, but no one saw anything else." Raised voices. Miss Marple's interest deepened. "What did they say?" "Hard to tell," Daniel admitted. "Just fragments. You promised no more lies. Something like that." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "It aligns with the letter found at the fete." Rowan looked puzzled. "You think the letter and the argument are connected?" "Almost certainly," she said. "But what strikes me most is that someone has worked hard to conceal the truth by exploiting the fact that these two are twins." Daniel frowned. "I don't understand." "Think carefully," Miss Marple said. "If one sister is dead, and the other missing, and the murder scene was staged to confuse which was which, the killer may have used their identical appearance as a smokescreen." Mrs. Blacklock gasped softly. "You mean someone wanted us to think it was Hetty, when it was Letty, or vice versa?" "That is the question," Miss Marple replied. "But more importantly, which sister wore the damaged shoe?" She reached into her bag and withdrew the blue heel found on the porch. Rowan handed her the shoe from the rose bed, the one with the broken strap. Miss Marple held them side by side, turning them carefully in her hands. "One is scuffed and broken," she said, "and the other pristine. This suggests the broken heel was worn in the murder scene. The other was left behind." Daniel's eyes darkened. "So Letty might be the missing one, wearing the undamaged shoe. If she's still alive, or running from something." Miss Marple finished softly. Mrs. Blacklock's face paled. "Then who? Who would want to kill Hetty, or Letty?" Miss Marple's gaze swept the small group before settling on the garden gate. "That, I am afraid, we shall have to discover." Later that day, the village began to whisper again. At the post office, the butcher's shop, and the schoolyard, the story grew and shifted with every telling. The twins, once the subject of casual intrigue, now became something darker, a tale of secrets, lies, and old grievances bubbling just beneath the surface of polite society. Miss Marple attended the afternoon tea at the vicarage, where the remaining villagers gathered under the watchful eye of Reverend Phipps. The conversation circled cautiously, each person eager to contribute their own theory, though none had hard facts to share. Mrs. Edgecombe was the first to speak. "I suppose it's obvious that whoever did this wanted to send a message. Perhaps a lover scorned, or a family feud. Those twins were always sharp, but we never knew much about their past." "I heard," chimed in Mrs. Weaver, "that one of them was mixed up with a man from London. A gambler, I believe. That could have been a motive." Thomas Braithwaite, who had been quietly listening from the corner, suddenly looked up. "There's also the piano teacher, Mr. Gerard. He left just before all this happened. No one seems to know why." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Mr. Gerard's departure is certainly suspicious, but I wonder if the story is more tangled still. The truth is rarely as simple as a single motive or person. Reverend Phipps sighed. Well, all we can do is wait for the coroner's report and hope the police find more clues. Miss Marple, watching the faces around her, was struck by the subtle shifts of expression, the quick glances, the nervous tics, the small evasions that spoke louder than words. She knew the village better than most. Beneath the veneer of friendship and civility, old wounds festered. Long-buried grudges and hidden betrayals were ready to surface like poison bubbles in a still pond. As the evening fell and the guests began to disperse, Miss Marple made her way to Ivybank Cottage once more. The moonlight cast long shadows across. The garden and the cool air smelled faintly of roses and damp earth. She knelt beside the rosebed again, running a gloved finger along the petals. Something was out of place, not the shoe, not the body, but something else, an invisible thread of deception only the most careful observer could detect. Her eyes caught a small indentation near the garden path, barely visible in the moonlight. Ida's footprint. Not a woman's, she thought, but larger, heavier. A man's. She rose slowly and looked toward the cottage windows, now dark and shuttered. The silence was broken only by the distant barking of a dog and the occasional rustle of leaves. Miss Marple's mind raced through possibilities. The sisters' quarrel, the mysterious letter, the absent Letty, the fleeing Mr. Gerard, the strange visitors the twins had entertained, all threads in a web of secrets she was only beginning to unravel. One thing was certain: the shoe without its match was only the beginning of the mystery. The truth lay buried beneath layers of deception, and it would take patience, subtlety, and keen insight to bring it to light. As she walked back through the village, Miss Marple knew the days ahead would be filled with difficult questions and reluctant answers. But she felt ready. For in Chipping Woodley, appearances could deceive even the sharpest eye, but not hers, not Miss Marple's. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the mist having lifted to reveal a pale sun illuminating the quiet village of Chipping Woodley. Miss Marple's footsteps were soft as she once again made her way toward Ivybank Cottage. The previous night's discovery of the mysterious footprint had added a new dimension to her thoughts, but there was still much to uncover. As she approached the cottage, she found Constable Rowan already there, standing by the garden gate with a thoughtful expression. He greeted her quietly, nodding toward the rose bed where the grim events had taken place. "We've taken another look at the footprints," Rowan said. "There's something else, too. A partial set of tire tracks leading away from the lane behind the garden. Not many vehicles use that path." Miss Marple studied the ground, noting the faint impressions barely visible in the soft soil. "A car, then? It might explain how the body was moved after the murder." Rowan glanced around cautiously. "There's more. We found a small scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush just beyond the garden wall. It's dark green with an unusual weave, not something common in the village." Miss Marple knelt, carefully examining the fragment. "It's finely made. Perhaps from a coat or jacket. Could belong to the killer," Rowan said grimly. "Or someone who stumbled onto the scene," she added thoughtfully. The sound of footsteps interrupted their conversation. It was Daniel Blacklock, who looked harried, his face carrying the weight of restless nights. "I've spoken to a few more people," he said. "The twins were never quite as close as everyone assumed. Letty especially had her secrets." "Secrets?" Miss Marple's interest was piqued. "Yes," Daniel replied. "I found out Letty had been meeting someone in secret, an older man from London. The villagers whispered about it but never named him." "Did you discover his name?" Daniel hesitated. "Mr. Philip Carrow. He's a retired businessman, recently moved to the village." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And what sort of meetings did they have? Private ones, letters, flowers, sometimes gifts. But last week, Letty's tone changed. She seemed worried, anxious. I don't think she wanted anyone else to know. Constable Rowan made a note. We'll look into Mr. Caro. Miss Marple felt the pieces shifting. The quiet village was not so quiet after all. Beneath the surface, lives were tangled in unexpected ways. Later that morning, Miss Marple visited the village post office, where Mrs. Edgecombe greeted her with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Miss Marple, what a surprise. Have you heard the latest? The police are certain the body is Hetty's, but some of us aren't convinced. Why is that? Miss Marple asked, settling into a chair. Well, I've known the twins since they were girls, Mrs. Edgecombe began, her voice lowering to a whisper. Hetty was the quieter one, studious, reliable. Letty was fiery, independent, always chasing something new. I wouldn't be surprised if they switched places now and then just for a bit of mischief. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is often the case with twins, but in this situation, it complicates matters. Exactly, Mrs. Edgecombe agreed. And then there's the matter of the shoe found on the porch. Whose shoe was that? It doesn't match the one on the body. Miss Marple nodded. A good question. Have you noticed anything unusual in the village recently? New arrivals, changes in behaviour? Mrs. Edgecombe hesitated. Well, there was Mr. Gerard, the piano teacher. He left quite suddenly after the fete. Some say he was upset about something, but no one knows what. I intend to speak with him, Miss Marple said quietly. As she left, Miss Marple reflected on the growing list of suspects and motives. The twin sisters' rivalry was clearly more than sibling squabbling. It was a complex web of secrets, resentments, and hidden alliances. Her next visit was to the village inn, where Mr. Gerard was known to frequent. The innkeeper greeted her with polite surprise and ushered her toward a quiet corner where the piano teacher sat alone, nursing a cup of tea. Mr. Gerard looked up, his face weary but composed. Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure? I hoped you might help me understand the events surrounding the fete, she said gently. You left the village quite abruptly. He sighed. I did. There were complications. I won't deny I had a quarrel with one of the twins. Letty, to be precise. Can you tell me more? He glanced away briefly. She was involved with Mr. Caro. I warned her that the man was trouble, but she wouldn't listen. When the argument escalated, I decided it was best to leave before things got out of hand. Did the argument happen on the evening of the fete? Yes, just before I left. I heard raised voices from the garden. It was distressing. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet understanding. Did you see anyone else there? No, but the twins seemed at odds, more than usual. There was something else, an envelope in Letty's hand. I couldn't read it, but she looked frightened. This confirmed the letter discovered earlier. As Miss Marple left the inn, her mind sifted through the new information. The presence of Mr. Caro, the mysterious letter, the sisters' fraught relationship, all pointed toward a motive deeper than jealousy or mere rivalry. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a stroll toward the village green, where she found Mrs. Blacklock sitting alone on a bench, gazing at the roses in the fading sunlight. May I join you? Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Blacklock nodded, her eyes glistening. It feels like the village is closing in on us. Miss Marple sat beside her. I know this is difficult, but the truth will come to light. Do you think Letty is still alive? Mrs. Blacklock whispered. Miss Marple considered carefully. It is possible. Someone may have hidden her away, or she may be too afraid to come forward. Mrs. Blacklock looked at her with hope mingled with despair. If only they could find her, if only this nightmare would end. Miss Marple placed a comforting hand over hers. Patience. The pieces are falling into place. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the village seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere, concealed by shadows and silence, secrets waited to be uncovered, and Miss Marple was ready to find them. That evening, the village pub hummed with a subdued energy, the usual lively chatter tempered by the shadow cast over Chipping Woodley. Miss Marple arrived quietly, her presence barely noticed among the gathering of familiar faces. She settled near the fireplace, allowing her gaze to drift casually over the crowd. The local folks, some animated, some hushed, all carried the weight of uncertainty like a shared cloak. Her thoughts returned to the fragment of fabric found near the thorn bush and the mysterious tire tracks that led away from the garden. Small details, easily dismissed by many, but to Miss Marple they were whispers in the silence, clues tucked in plain sight. It was then that Mr. Carrow entered the room, his tall frame slightly stooped, his movements deliberate. He scanned the room briefly before his eyes met Miss Marple's. She inclined her head in greeting, and after a moment's hesitation, he approached. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low but courteous. "I hear you've been asking questions about my visits with Letty." "I have," she replied gently. "I hope you don't mind." "Not at all," he said. "There's much that needs clearing up." He took a seat opposite her, folding his hands on the table. "I came to Chipping Woodley seeking peace, not trouble. Letty was special. We had an understanding, but recent days were difficult. She seemed troubled, afraid even. Did she mention why?" Mr. Carrow's eyes darkened. She feared someone was watching her. She hinted at secrets she wished to keep buried, things that could ruin more than just her reputation. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Secrets have a way of surfacing, often with unpleasant consequences." He sighed. "I did not want to cause scandal, so I kept silent. But if my presence has added to the village unrest, I am sorry." Miss Marple studied him carefully. There was sincerity in his tone, yet also a guardedness, as though he withheld more than he revealed. "Did Letty mention who might be watching?" Mr. Carrow shook his head. "No names, only vague threats." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Constable Rowan, who motioned discreetly to Miss Marple. "Miss Marple, a new development." She excused herself and followed him outside to a quiet corner. "We've found something at the village mill," Rowan said quietly. "A shoe, matching the one missing from the garden scene." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Where exactly?" "Near the riverbank behind the mill. It appears someone tried to discard it in the water, but abandoned the attempt. Has it been examined for clues?" "Not yet. We wanted you to see it first." Miss Marple nodded, and together they walked to the mill. The place was deserted at this hour, shadows stretching long across the uneven ground. There, half buried, in mud lay the shoe, an elegant black leather piece worn but well cared for. Miss Marple crouched, her fingers gently brushing the mud. "This confirms someone tried to conceal evidence. The question is who?" "We'll ask around," Rowan said. "But with so many suspects, it's difficult to know where to start." "Start with those closest to the twins," Miss Marple suggested. "Sometimes the answers lie in the bonds we least expect." Back in the village, the mood had shifted noticeably. Rumours swirled faster now, mingling with anxiety and fear. Miss Marple sensed the villagers' growing impatience for resolution and their increasing suspicion of one another. That night, as the village settled into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat by the window in her cottage, reflecting on the tangled threads she had begun to unravel, the fragments of fabric, the shoe, the mysterious meetings, all pieces of a puzzle that was far from complete. Her mind returned to the letter found clutched in Letty's hand, the whispered threats, and the sudden departure of Mr. Gerard. Something was amiss, a motive lurking beneath the surface, concealed by appearances and silence. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. It was Miss Lenthal, the village schoolteacher, who arrived with a stack of letters she said Letty had entrusted to her for safekeeping. "I thought you might want to see these," she explained, her voice low. Miss Marple accepted the letters, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded the first one. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the words full of urgency and fear. They spoke of debts, blackmail, and a plan to reveal a damaging secret unless certain demands were met. Reading further, Miss Marple uncovered a web of deceit reaching beyond the village. Financial troubles, a hidden past, and alliances formed in desperation. Letty had been trapped in a dangerous game, one that may have cost her her life. The letters also mentioned a meeting scheduled for the night of the fête, a rendezvous that Letty feared could change everything. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the mysterious envelope Mr. Gerard had seen. Could this meeting have been the final catalyst? Was Letty's silence to prevent the secret's exposure? Determined to delve deeper, Miss Marple arranged to speak with the local doctor, Dr. Avery, who had attended the twins' mother in recent years. She hoped his knowledge of the family might shed light on possible motives hidden in the past. Dr. Avery welcomed her warmly, but there was a hint of unease in his eyes. "The Blacklocks have long been a complicated family," he said carefully. "Secrets and grudges passed down like heirlooms. Do you believe the past could be tied to recent events?" He nodded slowly. "It's possible. I recall incidents years ago, arguments over inheritances, accusations that never saw the light of day." Miss Marple pondered this. The village's veneer of peace masked deep undercurrents, the kind that could lead to desperate acts. That evening, as twilight settled over Chipping Woodley, Miss Marple walked the familiar lanes, her keen eyes searching for overlooked signs. She paused by the garden wall, where the scrap of fabric had been found. Something about it still bothered her. Suddenly, a sound caught her attention, a soft rustling from the undergrowth nearby. She stepped closer and found a folded piece of paper, partially hidden beneath a fallen leaf. Carefully, she unfolded it. The note was brief, but chilling. "You don't know what you're dealing with. Stop asking questions, or you'll regret it." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her voice remained steady as she whispered to herself, "The game is far from over." In the days that followed, the village held its breath. Every glance, every whispered conversation seemed charged with meaning. The mystery deepened, and Miss Marple knew she was closing in on a truth that would shake Chipping Woodley to its core. But first, she would need to unravel the tangled web of deception and confront the hidden shadows before the killer could strike again. The warning note weighed heavily on Miss Marple's mind as she returned to her cottage, the chill evening air prickling her skin despite the mildness of the season. She placed the paper carefully on her writing desk, next to the letters from Letty, and poured herself a cup of tea, eyes never quite leaving the window that framed the quiet village street. The village, with its neat cottages and whispering trees, seemed unchanged, yet beneath its placid surface stirred secrets that could shatter its fragile peace. The note's threatening tone was a stark reminder that the murderer was still among them, someone willing to intimidate even the most cautious. But Miss Marple had never been one to be cowed by veiled threats. If anything, they only confirmed that she was on the right path. The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage. Reverend Holt was known for his gentle demeanour and was a man who, over the years, had come to know the village's histories better than most. If anyone could shed light on the undercurrents running beneath Chipping Woodley's surface, it would be him. She found the vicar tending to his modest garden, a quiet sanctuary of roses and lavender. He looked up with a warm smile, but a trace of weariness in his eyes. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe this visit?" "I wonder if you might help me, Reverend," she said. "The Blacklock family, especially. Their history, relationships, anything that might explain the tensions recently, come to light. The vicar wiped his hands on his sleeves, his face growing somber. The Blacklocks have always been a complicated story. The twins' mother, Marian, was a woman of strong will and secrets. There were whispers long ago, disputes over property, accusations of deceit, even talk of a scandal involving her late husband's business affairs. Miss Marple nodded, listening intently. Did Marian have enemies in the village? Enemies is a strong word, he mused, but there were certainly those who envied the family's standing, and others who feared the consequences of uncovering their secrets. Marian was known to be fiercely protective, even to the point of alienating friends and family. Do you know if Letty ever confided in you? Reverend Holt shook his head. She was reserved in my presence, though I sensed a burden weighing on her. I wish I had pressed her more, but some matters are too delicate. Thanking him, Miss Marple departed with a clearer picture, but also more questions. The tangled history of the Blacklocks seemed a fertile ground for motives. On her way back, Miss Marple stopped by the village post office, a hub for gossip and information. The postmistress, Mrs. Fenwick, was in the midst of recounting the latest news to a small group of listeners. I heard from the new vicar's wife that Mr. Gerard's sudden departure wasn't just about the garden fete. Something about a quarrel with the twins' mother. Miss Marple approached quietly. Mrs. Fenwick, might I have a word? The postmistress turned, her eyes narrowing. Of course, Miss Marple. What's on your mind? Do you know anything? More about this quarrel, Mrs. Fenwick sighed. Only what people say behind closed doors. Marian was strict and could be quite harsh, especially with Letty and Mary. Some say the quarrel involved money, others say it was over loyalty, who was to inherit what. And Mr. Gerard, did he speak to you about it? Not directly, but he seemed troubled. And then he left in such a hurry. Miss Marple's mind pieced together a growing mosaic. Secrets, strained relationships, and the ominous letter warning her off. Yet the mystery remained elusive, a puzzle whose pieces refused to align. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mary Blacklock, Letty's twin, who had been staying with relatives since the tragedy. The young woman received her with quiet gratitude, eyes shadowed by grief, but also steely determination. I want to understand what happened to Letty, Mary said softly. She never told me everything, but I know she was scared of someone in this village. Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile. Fear is a powerful force, Miss Blacklock. It sharpens the senses, but it can also cloud judgment. Mary nodded. There were moments when Letty spoke in riddles, about debts she owed, threats made. I feared for her. Did she mention anyone in particular? Mary hesitated. No names, but there was a man she trusted once who disappeared from her life after a bitter argument. The mention of this stranger sparked a memory for Miss Marple. Mr. Carrow, perhaps, the man with whom Letty had a mysterious connection and who now seemed to hold pieces of the truth. Encouraged, Miss Marple resolved to speak with him again. If anyone could shed light on Letty's last days, it was he. That evening, a brisk knock came at her door. To her surprise, it was Mr. Gerard, returned unexpectedly. His face bore the exhaustion of a man weighed down by secrets. I thought it best to come back, he said, voice low. There are things I need to say. Miss Marple invited him inside, offering tea and a calm presence that seemed to ease his burden. I left hastily because I feared being caught in a storm not of my making, he began. The quarrel with Marian was more serious than anyone knows. It was about the twins' inheritance and the truth about their father's business. Miss Marple leaned forward. Go on. Marian suspected me of foul play in the family's affairs, but I was innocent. Still, her accusations isolated me. Letty, though, she believed in me. But even she was caught in the crossfire. What crossfire? Gerard swallowed hard. There were people who wanted the past to remain buried. People willing to silence anyone who threatened their position. Miss Marple's mind raced. This revelation tied many threads together. The quarrel, Letty's fear, the threatening letter. Do you know who these people might be? Gerard hesitated, then nodded slowly. There's one. Someone close to the family. Someone whose reputation depends on keeping these secrets hidden. As the night deepened, the weight of confession settled between them. Miss Marple felt the pieces beginning to form a picture, yet the final outline remained obscured. The next morning brought a fresh discovery. At the village market, a vendor found a small, ornate locket near the riverbank, the same area where the shoe was discarded. Inside was a faded photograph of Marion Blacklock and an unknown man, their faces serious, their connection ambiguous. Miss Marple examined the locket closely, her eyes narrowing. This was no ordinary keepsake. It was a symbol of a hidden relationship, one that could explain the tangled loyalties and the deadly consequences. She resolved to seek out the man in the photograph wherever he might be and to finally uncover the truth that had cost Letty her life. As the sun set behind the rolling hills, casting long shadows over Chipping Woodley, Miss Marple understood that the village's peaceful facade had been shattered for good. But with patience and quiet observation, she would bring the darkness into the light and reveal the murderer hiding in plain sight. The discovery of the locket, its delicate chain catching the late morning light as it rested in the palm of the hay, village vendor, stirred a ripple of whispered excitement through Chipping Woodley. It was an artifact that seemed to belong to another era, an intimate relic that now felt heavy with consequence. Miss Marple held it gingerly, as if afraid that it might crumble beneath the weight of its secrets. The photograph inside was faded, the edges worn smooth by time and handling. Marion Blacklock's stern face stared back at her, framed by the shadow of a man whose features were unfamiliar but marked by a certain distinguished bearing. The question pressing upon Miss Marple was simple, yet profound. Who was this man, and what part did he play in the tangled history that had led to Letty's death? She spent the morning revisiting the old village records, a habit that often served her well when seeking to unravel the skeins of the past. At the local archive, tucked away beneath a collection of parish documents and brittle newspapers, she found a faint mention of a certain Charles Pennington, a businessman who had lived in Chipping Woodley decades earlier and had been associated with the Blacklock family through marriage and business dealings. A sudden thought took shape in Miss Marple's mind. Could Charles Pennington be the man in the photograph? Her intuition urged her to seek out anyone who might remember Pennington or have ties to his descendants. The village was small, its inhabitants linked by generations of shared history, and Miss Marple was confident that the right question asked in the right place would yield answers. Later that afternoon she visited the village pub, the Fox and Hound, a place where the current and past often collided over a pint and shared recollections. The atmosphere was thick with the usual chatter, but Miss Marple's entrance brought a brief hush. She approached the bar, where the landlord, Mr. Bramley, polished glasses with a methodical rhythm. "Mr. Bramley," she began gently, "I wonder if you might recall a gentleman named Charles Pennington. He lived here some time ago, I believe." Bramley's brow furrowed, the mention striking a chord. "Pennington. Now there's a name from the past. I've heard my father mention him, said he was a man with more ambition than sense, mixed up in some sharp deals that ended poorly." Miss Marple pressed on, careful to keep her tone light. "Do you know if Pennington had any descendants or relations still in the area?" Bramley scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Not that I'm aware of. The family seemed to vanish after some scandal that rocked the village, something about fraud or misappropriation, There was talk that Pennington was at odds with the Blacklocks before he disappeared. The pieces began to fall into place. A family feud, a vanished businessman, a scandal that had left scars buried beneath the village's quiet exterior. Miss Marple thanked Bramley and left, with a growing sense of the depth of the mystery she was peeling back. That evening, back at her cottage, she received an unexpected visitor. It was Mary Blacklock, her expression determined but shadowed by anxiety. "Miss Marple, I've been thinking about what you said, about secrets and past grudges. There's something I need to tell you, something I kept from everyone because I was afraid." Miss Marple gestured for her to sit. "You can... Trust me, Mary, whatever it is, it will help us find the truth." Mary took a deep breath. Before Letty died, she mentioned receiving strange letters, unsigned, but filled with warnings and veiled threats. She never showed them to me, but I found one hidden among her things after everything. She handed Miss Marple a folded piece of paper, the handwriting faint but deliberate. The note warned Letty to stay silent about the sins of the past, or face dire consequences. It mentioned a name: Pennington. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "This confirms that Charles Pennington's story is far from over. Someone is still protecting his reputation, or what remains of it." Mary nodded, tears brimming. Letty believed the truth would destroy the family. She wanted to protect us all, but it cost her everything. The following morning, Miss Marple set out to find the only person who might clarify the mystery of Pennington's disappearance: Edmund Pennington, Charles's nephew, who had recently been spotted visiting the village. Tracking him down took her to a modest cottage on the outskirts, where a tall man with greying hair opened the door, surprise flickering across his face. "Miss Marple," he said cautiously, "I wasn't expecting a visitor. I'm sorry to intrude, Mr. Pennington, but I believe you might hold answers about your uncle and the Blacklock family," she said gently. Edmund hesitated, then stepped aside to invite her in. "It's been many years since my family's name was spoken here. I don't know if I can help." As they sat by the fire, Miss Marple unfolded the story she had pieced together, watching Edmund closely for signs of recognition or denial. His face darkened at the mention of Marion Blacklock. "My uncle's dealings with the Blacklocks were complicated. There were accusations of betrayal on both sides, but the truth is muddied by years of bitterness and silence." "Do you know what happened to Charles Pennington, Miss Marple?" asked Edmund, sighed heavily. "He vanished after a scandal that destroyed his business and reputation. Some say he fled abroad, others whisper darker things, that he was silenced to keep the family secrets buried." Miss Marple felt the weight of those unspoken words. "And the letter sent to Letty?" Edmund's eyes filled with regret. "I can only assume someone believes those secrets must remain hidden, no matter the cost." Before she left, Edmund gave Miss Marple an old envelope addressed to him by his uncle. Inside was a letter, its contents cryptic, but hinting at a hidden ledger, a record of financial transactions that could reveal the true nature of the family's disputes. The discovery of the letter offered a new lead, and with it, a fresh surge of hope. Miss Marple knew that uncovering the ledger could expose the motives that had driven Letty's killer to silence her. That afternoon she confided in Inspector Craddock, who had returned to the village after a brief absence. "This ledger might be the key to cracking the case," she said. "If it exists, it will show who stood to gain most from the family's downfall." Craddock frowned, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I'll organize a search of the Blacklock estate. If there's anything left hidden there, we'll find it." As the day faded into evening, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the villagers, whose lives were intertwined in this drama. The air was thick with anticipation and unease, as if the very ground beneath Chipping Woodley waited for the truth to surface. That night, as the village slept, a shadow moved near the Blacklock estate. A figure slipped through the undergrowth, searching for something long concealed, The game was far from over, and the final moves were yet to be played. Miss Marple, however, felt a quiet certainty. The puzzle was nearly complete. Soon, all would be revealed. The next morning dawned cool and clear over Chipping Woodley, the village still hushed with the weight of unsettled questions. The night's shadowy intruder remained a secret for now, but the tension woven through the air was tangible, felt even in the soft footsteps of Miss Marple as she made her way toward the Blacklock estate with Inspector Craddock. The manor, a once stately home, weathered by time and neglect, stood silent beneath the pale sky. Its stone walls bore the scars of forgotten disputes, and the overgrown gardens whispered of days long past. Craddock's boots crunched along the gravel as they approached the grand front door, which was ajar, a detail that did not escape the keen eyes of Miss Marple. "Someone's been here recently," Craddock murmured, his voice low. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint scent of mildew. The two moved carefully through the dim corridors, their footsteps echoing softly. Miss Marple's gaze was drawn to the portraits lining the walls, faces stern and proud, eyes that seemed to watch and judge. They reached the library, a cavernous room filled with towering shelves of leather-bound volumes. It was here, according to Edmund Pennington's letter, that the ledger might be concealed. Craddock began a methodical search, pulling books from the shelves, tapping at panels, while Miss Marple examined the room's details with her usual quiet attentiveness. Near the fireplace, she noticed a small brass lever cleverly disguised as part of the mantle's ornate design. With a gentle tug, a section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow recess. Inside lay an old leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed but intact. "Here it is," Miss Marple said softly, her fingers tracing the cover. The ledger that could change everything. Craddock took the book carefully, flipping through the pages. The entries were meticulous, recording a series of transactions involving the Blacklock and Pennington families. As they pored over the figures, a pattern of deception emerged. Hidden loans, diverted funds, and payments made to unknown recipients. The ledger hinted at a financial conspiracy that had shattered reputations and fortunes. "This confirms much of what we suspected," Craddock said grimly. "But it also raises new questions. Who benefited the most, and who had the most to fear from Letty uncovering these secrets?" Miss Marple nodded. "And why the threats? Someone wanted to keep these records buried no matter the cost." Their investigation was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. It was Mary Blacklock, her face pale but resolute. "I've come to speak with you. There's something you need to know. About the night Letty died." She stepped inside, hesitating before she spoke. "I was with her that evening. She wanted to meet someone in secret, someone she trusted. I didn't know who, but she was nervous, worried she might be followed." Miss Marple's interest deepened. "Did she say where this meeting was to take place?" Mary glanced away, her fingers twisting anxiously. "The old boathouse by the lake. She left just after dinner, but she never came back." The three of them exchanged looks, the puzzle growing more intricate. The boathouse had long been abandoned, a place of whispered village lore and faded memories. It was the kind of setting where secrets might hide, or where a confrontation could turn deadly. Without hesitation, Miss Marple and Craddock set out for the lake, with Mary leading the way. The path wound through ancient trees whose branches arched like protective arms, shadows flickering in the dappled light. At the water's edge, the boathouse loomed, its weather-beaten timbers creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, the air was cool and damp. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the floor, where footprints marked the dust, some fresh, some faded. Among the debris, She spotted a torn scrap of fabric caught on a nail, a piece of the distinctive patterned scarf Letty had been seen wearing earlier that day. "This confirms Letty was here," Miss Marple murmured. "But who else?" Craddock shone his torch along the walls, revealing faint scuff marks and what appeared to be a hastily scrawled message on the wooden planks. The words were nearly illegible, but with careful scrutiny they read, "The truth sinks." The cryptic phrase sent a chill through the group. It suggested a warning, or perhaps a final message left by Letty herself. As they left the boathouse, the tension in the village seemed to thicken. Rumours began to spread that Letty had been involved in uncovering a long-hidden betrayal, and that the man who had followed her that night might be closer than anyone imagined. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple pondered the latest revelations. The ledger, the mysterious visitor, the secret meeting, all pieces of a dark mosaic that reached far beyond a simple family feud. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Reverend Arthur Bell, his expression grave. "Miss Marple, I fear there is news from the churchyard." Together they walked toward the small graveyard, where Letty's resting place had been disturbed. The earth was freshly turned, and a small box lay half-buried nearby. Inside was a collection of letters, old correspondences between members of the Blacklock and Pennington families. Miss Marple sifted through the papers, uncovering confessions, accusations, and veiled threats dating back decades. It became clear that the village's peaceful facade concealed a web of lies and resentments, tangled around power, love, and betrayal. One letter stood out, a note from Marian Blacklock to Charles Pennington, pleading for forgiveness and hinting at a secret that could destroy them both. The implications were staggering. The past was not dead, it was alive and poisoning the present. As the sun set behind the rolling hills, Miss Marple knew the next steps would be critical. The game was changing, and the true depth of the mystery was beginning to emerge. But one question remained. Who among the villagers was willing to kill to keep the past buried, and who would be the next to pay the price? Miss Marple sat quietly in her cosy sitting room, the faint crackle of the fire mingling with the weighty silence that had settled over the village of Chipping Woodley. The letters from the churchyard lay neatly spread across the small oak table before her, their fragile pages yellowed and worn, yet each word spoke with unmistakable clarity of past grievances and long-buried secrets. As the shadows deepened outside, so too did the complexity of the mystery at hand. Her thoughts returned repeatedly to the letter from Marian Blacklock, the one penned in trembling script and laden with desperation. Marian had confessed to Charles. Pennington, not merely begging forgiveness, but warning that the consequences of their past actions could ripple far into the future. Miss Marple's mind gently unfolded the possibilities. What secret had Marian held so closely? What shadow from the past had unsettled the fragile peace of this village? And who stood to lose the most if the truth were to be revealed? A soft knock at the door drew her attention. It was Mary Blacklock, who entered hesitantly, her eyes still swollen from sleepless nights. "Miss Marple, I've been thinking," she said, taking a seat by the fire. "There's something about Letty I haven't told anyone, something I didn't understand until now." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "You may tell me anything, Mary. Sometimes the smallest details make the greatest difference." Mary hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. Letty was worried, not just about the ledger or the money. She was afraid of someone in the village who wanted to silence her. She said this person knew her every move, that she was being watched. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did she say who?" "No, she never named anyone, but she mentioned a visitor, an old friend from London, someone she trusted enough to meet at the boathouse." She thought that meeting might help her find a way out. That visitor intrigued Miss Marple. Who could it be? And why had Letty kept it secret from her own family? The layers of deception were deepening. The following morning, Miss Marple arranged to meet with Inspector Craddock at the village hall. She shared Mary's revelation and the discovery of the letters, emphasizing the growing sense that this was not merely a dispute over money, but a tangled web of relationships and old wounds. Craddock frowned, rubbing his chin. It's clear now that this isn't a straightforward case. We need to find out who this visitor was. Maybe they hold the key to everything. Miss Marple agreed. Indeed, and meanwhile, it would be wise to watch the villagers carefully. Sometimes the guilty cannot resist revealing themselves even in the smallest gestures. As the day wore on, the village buzzed quietly with its usual activity, yet beneath the surface, the undercurrents of fear and suspicion ran strong. Miss Marple found herself drawn to the village square, where neighbours gathered and whispers slipped like shadows through the crowd. She listened closely, catching fragments of conversation that others might dismiss. A shopkeeper's nervous glance, a sudden silence when a particular name was mentioned, a hesitant step backward when confronted by an eager question. One such encounter was with Edith, the baker's wife, who had often been overlooked as merely a busybody with little else to occupy her thoughts. But Miss Marple knew better. Edith had eyes and ears everywhere, and her knowledge of village gossip was unparalleled. Miss Marple, Edith began cautiously, I heard something odd last night. Mr. Foster, the estate manager, was seen near the boathouse after dark. Said he was checking on some repairs, but he was alone and seemed rather agitated. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Alone, you say? And after dark? Yes, and that's not all. A few days ago he was overheard, arguing with Letty quite fiercely near the village green. Something about keeping things quiet. The pieces began to fit. Foster's agitation, his argument with Letty, the secrecy surrounding the ledger, all pointed toward a man with much to lose. Miss Marple decided to pay Mr. Foster a visit the next morning. His cottage sat on the edge of the village, neat but unremarkable, with a garden carefully tended despite the chill in the air. When she arrived, he was alone, fussing over some papers at his small kitchen table. Mr. Foster, she began gently, I wonder if I might ask you a few questions about Letty Blacklock. He looked up, startled but quickly recovering with a polite nod. Of course, Miss Marple. Anything I can do to help. I understand you and Letty had a disagreement not long before her death, she said carefully. He hesitated, then sighed. Yes, she was concerned about the ledger. Said it might cause trouble if certain names came to light. I told her it was best not to stir up old ghosts. Some things are better left alone. Did you warn her? Miss Marple asked quietly. Foster's eyes darkened. I warned her to be careful, that's all. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. And the night she disappeared, were you near the boathouse? Only to check on some maintenance, he replied. I swear I left before anything happened. There was truth in his voice, but also something unspoken, a tension Miss Marple could not ignore. Leaving Foster's cottage, Miss Marple felt the threads pulling tighter. The village was a place where the past clung stubbornly to the present, where old alliances and grudges simmered just beneath polite smiles. Later that afternoon, she received a message from Mary Blacklock. Miss Marple, you should come quickly. There's been another incident. Arriving at the Blacklock estate, Miss Marple found a gathering of concerned villagers outside the house. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and heavy. Mary explained breathlessly, the gardener, Mr. Harper, discovered a note pinned to Letty's door, a warning. It says, stop digging or you'll be next. Miss Marple carefully took the note, noting the hurried, jagged handwriting. It was a threat, unmistakably meant to intimidate. The message confirmed that someone was desperate to keep the secrets, buried, willing to escalate matters to frighten those close to the truth. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the village, Miss Marple contemplated the escalating danger. Whoever was behind these threats was growing bolder, and the stakes had never been higher. She resolved to watch closely, knowing that in the subtle exchanges of glances and quiet movements, the real story was beginning to reveal itself. And in the heart of Chipping Woodley, the game was far from over. The village of Chipping Woodley lay wrapped in a chill mist the next morning, the air heavy with unspoken tension and the faint scent of damp earth. Miss Marple stood by the window of her modest sitting room, gazing out toward the village green, where small groups of villagers had already gathered, speaking in hushed tones. The morning's quiet was deceptive. Beneath it lay the undercurrents of fear and suspicion that had only deepened since Letty Blacklock's death. As the village stirred to life, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the threatening note pinned to Letty's door. The handwriting, jagged and urgent, suggested panic, or perhaps a calculated attempt to intimidate. Whoever had written it wanted to keep others away from the secrets Letty was uncovering, or perhaps to silence her entirely. Adieu. Letter's existence confirmed one unsettling truth. The killer was not only among them, but felt the need to warn others. That meant the threat was ongoing, the danger far from over. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Craddock, his usual calm demeanour tempered by a furrowed brow. "Good morning, Miss Marple. I thought I might discuss the latest developments. Please come in," she said, motioning him to sit by the fire. Craddock sank into the chair, clasping his hands. "The note has stirred the village. There's talk of locking doors, of watching each other. It's the kind of atmosphere that breeds mistakes. We must be cautious." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes, and caution is precisely what we must exercise. Panic makes people careless, and the guilty can be careless or clever enough to exploit that." Craddock glanced at her thoughtfully. "Have you any new insights? Something the police might have overlooked?" She smiled faintly. "It's often the small things, Inspector. The things people think are unimportant. The way a glance lingers too long, or a word is left unsaid." Craddock frowned. "I'm afraid the villagers are not cooperative. Most have something to hide, or at least something they wish to conceal." "That, too, is a useful observation," Miss Marple replied. "In a village, secrets have long memories." The day progressed with an undercurrent of unease. Miss Marple resolved to revisit the boathouse, the scene of many quiet meetings and whispered exchanges. The evening before, she had noticed subtle signs that had escaped her attention. Faint footprints in the mud, not entirely consistent with Letty's, usual gait, and a small fragment of cloth snagged on a broken branch. At the boathouse, she crouched, examining the ground closely. The footprints were fresh, but not Letty's. They suggested haste, someone coming or going in a rush. The fragment of cloth was delicate, possibly from a scarf or handkerchief. Such a detail might seem trivial to many, but to Miss Marple, it was a thread that could unravel the whole fabric of the mystery. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound, footsteps approaching rapidly from the path behind. She straightened as Mary Blacklock appeared, face pale but determined. "Miss Marple," Mary said breathlessly, "there's something I've just remembered. Letty mentioned an argument she had with Mr. Foster the day before she disappeared. She said it was about more than the ledger, something about old debts and family pride." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Old debts and family pride. Words heavy with meaning in a village like this. Mary nodded. "And she told me she feared Mr. Foster might do something drastic to keep those debts hidden." Miss Marple stood thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mary. This is a valuable piece of the puzzle." Together, they walked slowly back toward the village. Miss Marple's mind raced with possibilities. The ledger was clearly a catalyst, but the roots of the conflict ran much deeper, into the history of the families, their pride and grievances that spanned generations. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself at the village inn where a small crowd had gathered. She quietly observed the interactions, noting how eyes darted away when certain names were mentioned, how voices lowered when discussing the Blacklocks or the Penningtons. She was joined by Edith, the baker's wife, who leaned in conspiratorially. "Miss Marple, I saw Mr. Foster earlier. He was meeting with Mrs. Pennington and they seemed very secretive. I wouldn't be surprised if there's more to their connection than just business." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Secrecy often hides motives. It seems the ledger is only the tip of a much larger iceberg. As the afternoon waned, a sudden commotion outside drew Miss Marple's attention. A group of villagers was gathered near the village green, clustered around the figure of Mr. Harper, the gardener. His face was pale, and in his hand he held a crumpled piece of paper. Miss Marple approached. "What has happened?" Harper unfolded the paper, revealing a second threatening note, this one more direct and menacing. "Stop the digging, or the next one won't be a warning." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple took the note gently, examining it under the fading light. The handwriting was strikingly similar to the first note, jagged, hurried, designed to intimidate. The escalation was clear. The unknown assailant was growing bolder, willing to threaten more openly. Turning to the villagers, Miss Marple's voice was calm but firm. "This is a warning that cannot be ignored. Whoever sent this wants to frighten those who seek the truth. But threats are a sign of weakness, not strength." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others glancing nervously around. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat once more by her fire, the weight of the unfolding events heavy on her shoulders. The village, with all its quaint charm, was a place where appearances masked dark realities. Beneath the polite facades, old wounds festered, and the consequences of past actions were reaching into the present with deadly force. She thought of Letty, brave, curious, and determined to uncover what others wished left alone. Her death was a tragedy, but also a key to unlocking the secrets that threatened to consume Chipping Woodley. Miss Marple resolved to tread carefully in the coming days. The killer was still among them, watching, waiting. But she would be watching too, patient and unassuming, ready to catch the smallest slip, the quietest confession, the telltale glance. For in this village, justice was not found in the loud accusations or the obvious suspects, but in the gentle persistence of a keen mind and a heart attuned to the subtle truths of human nature. And soon, she knew, the final pieces of the puzzle would fall into place. In the late afternoon light, the village hall was filled with an expectant hush. The entire community had gathered at Miss Marple's invitation, drawn by the promise of clarity in a mystery that had unsettled them all. Faces that had once whispered accusations in shadows now looked toward her with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Miss Marple stood quietly at the front, her hands folded calmly as she surveyed the room. The clues had long pointed in conflicting directions, but now the threads wove together with unmistakable clarity. She began not with accusation but with gentle observation, recounting the events and subtle signs that had escaped notice until now. The ledger, so carefully hidden, was more than just numbers on a page. It represented a tangled web of debts and long-held grudges that stretched back decades. Letty Blacklock was determined to bring these truths to light, and for that, she paid the ultimate price. She spoke of the threatening notes, words meant to frighten, but revealing more than the author intended, the handwriting, the urgency, and the choice of words all spoke of someone deeply familiar with Letty's movements and the village's undercurrents. Miss Marple turned slowly toward Mr. Foster, whose pallor betrayed a flicker of unease. "You Mr. Foster, have long held the village's history and finances in your grasp. Your family's pride and secrets were threatened by Letty's investigation. Yet the final act was not a simple outburst of anger. She stepped closer, voice soft but unwavering. The fragment of cloth found at the boathouse. The hurried footsteps caught in the mud. These were not Letty's. You went there to confront her, but the deed was done by someone else. Someone you sought to protect or conceal. A sharp intake of breath stirred the room. Miss Marple's eyes met those of Mrs. Pennington, whose composure cracked just slightly. Mrs. Pennington, your meetings with Mr. Foster were more than casual business. You both feared exposure, but it was your desperation that crossed the line. The villagers leaned in as Miss Marple revealed how the fabric came from a scarf Mrs. Pennington had been seen wearing only hours before Letty's death. She described the subtle signs, the nervousness, the avoidance of direct questions, and the silent acknowledgements that spoke volumes. Letty's death was a tragic act born of fear and the hope to protect a fragile reputation. The ledger's secrets were a threat none could afford, and so a plan was hatched to silence the truth. But truth has a way of emerging, and justice is not so easily buried. Mrs. Pennington's face crumpled as she quietly admitted her guilt, the room heavy with the weight of revelation. The village's collective breath seemed to release in that moment, a tension finally broken. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple remained seated, serene and contemplative. The village would heal slowly, the scars beneath the surface slowly mended by the truth now brought into the light. She reflected on the nature of human frailty, how pride, fear, and love can twist into dark motives, yet how patience and quiet observation can unravel even the most carefully woven lies. In Chipping Woodley, life would return to its gentle rhythm, but the memory of Letty Blacklock's courage and Miss Marple's quiet persistence would linger, a testament to the enduring power of understanding human nature, where even the smallest clues hold the key to justice.